Good morning. You got to go through this process of turning all the switches and buttons on. Here we go. I think I got that right. This is a U.S. government report from 1909. And it is addressing a major crisis within the United States of a plague that is sweeping through the United States, but especially the southern part of the United States. In fact, what you see circled here is very prominently mentioned Charlotte, North Carolina area. And the plague was called pellagra. It is estimated that by the end of about a decade later, that there were more than 3 million Americans that were suffering from this deadly disease, and more than 100,000 had died. It was a huge medical and health crisis in the United States. Pasteur had identified a few decades before that germs caused diseases, and for a number of years, the scientists in the United States struggled to find the germ that was causing this disease that, as you see in this drawing, would discolor the skin, especially that exposed to the sun, and cause further and further debilitating symptoms and ultimately death. And they couldn't find the germ. They looked and looked. And finally, somebody realized, wait a minute, germs aren't the cause of this. And when they found the cure, pellagra almost completely disappeared from the United States. Anybody want to guess what the cure was? I only mean this slightly in jest, because what actually, the box of cornflakes is part of it, but it's actually the nutritional information on the other side. Pellagra was caused by a lack of vitamin B, niacin. And because of that, the government began fortifying bread flour, and then later, obviously, breakfast cereals. And this deadly disease that had killed hundreds of thousands, the 100,000 number is probably way too low. Hundreds of thousands of people didn't have to die simply because they sprayed some fortifying vitamins on bread flour and breakfast cereal. Isn't that an interesting story? Now, my point about this is that it was an incredibly terrifying and deadly disease. They had identified that. But what they failed to recognize literally for decades is that the solution was right there in front of them. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about the beginning section of Hebrews and talk about it in terms of this very concept. From Hebrews 3, this in many ways begins the section of teaching in the book of Hebrews, as he says, "Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession." Do you understand? He's talking to you, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling. This is us. He is writing to us and says, I want you to consider Jesus. But just a few verses down from that is this. Verse 12. Now notice the connection. He begins with holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling. And then in verse 12 he says, take care, brethren, warning, lest there should be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. Let me tell you what, when we talk about deadly, we talk about crisis, here we go. Take care, brethren. And we have this image of our brothers and sisters falling away from the living God and abandoning the salvation that is possible. And this is the deadly disease. But what is causing this deadly disease? The book of Hebrews, which I believe the entire theme of Hebrews could be summed up in 2 words, which is don't leave. What What do you think the deadly disease is? Is it false teachers? Is it corruption in the government or the violence that is being perpetrated upon the Christians as they are being taken and imprisoned and killed? Is that the danger that he wants to address that would cause them to fall away? No. In chapter 2, he says this, "For this reason we must pay closer attention to what we have heard so that we do not drift away from it." Verse 3, "How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? After it was first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard," and the sentence continues on. Do you see that the deadly disease of falling away from the living God has within its origins the most simple kind of thing that can slip below our radar? Drift, neglect. Drift is an interesting concept. Largest warship ever built in human history is the new aircraft carrier, the Gerald R. Ford. It is 100,000 tons of steel. That's an amazing number. But you know what they have to do when that ship, with its nuclear power, it has 2 huge nuclear power plants in it to power the thing. It can go fast enough that you could actually water ski behind it. But you know what? When they bring it to the dock, they have to tie it down simply because a breeze could push it away from the dock. And their $14 billion warship could drift away. The danger for us that is identified in the book of Hebrews is drift and neglect. So how does the book of Hebrews addresses this? A number of ways. We have Hebrews 10 and a lot of other places we could take a look at. But just in this beginning section, I want to talk about how this book begins. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets and in many portions and in many ways in these last days, has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. And he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature. He upholds all things by the word of his power. And when he had made purification for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much better than the angels as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. And he makes an argument for the next chapter and a few verses about understanding who he had only identifies here as the Son. Look at all the things that he says. This is the one who came in these last days and has shown us the perfect reflection of the Creator. He is the Creator. And this is who we're dealing with in these last days has been revealed perfectly through the Son. And then he makes this comparison. And he makes the comparison, I want you to notice, after this statement. When he has made purification for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. I want you to keep that in your mind. But then the comparison is, all the way through this section, that this is so much greater than even the angels. Adam, a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, talked about the power of an angel and compared them to the nuclear arsenals that were available to the players in the Cold War. One angel, one day, 180,000 people, soldiers dead. Let me tell you what, that's not a casual comparison. And he says here, so much greater than the angels. And as he says this, as he has listed these things, it is the Son, he has appointed heir of all things, he made the world, the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of the nature of the Father, upholding all things. And then in this amazing statement in verse 8, but Of the Son, he said, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. Can he do more? The writer of Hebrews, to separate out the Son from all of the creation and anyone else. But where he's going with this is kind of fascinating. And we're skipping some of his images and some of his argument here for the sake of time. But I want to focus on this verse. But we do see him, who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. I want to make 4 points here. The first is, I want you to notice where we are. This is chapter 2, verse 9. Up until this moment, the writer of Hebrews has not used the name Jesus, but saves it for this moment, namely Jesus. This is the exact one we're talking about. Let there be no misunderstanding. Namely Jesus. But he also begins this section with this statement. But we do see him. That, to me, is one of the challenges that we are facing when we partake of the Lord's Supper. I must see him. Not in the ocular sense of the word, but in my understanding, in my knowledge, even in my passion. I need to see him. And the writer of Hebrews at this critical moment, as he is drawing his introductory thoughts together, as he's drawing this conclusion, says, do you see him? We see him. And there, this one Jesus, who was so much in the beginning and has come to this place, this Jesus. What Jesus is he talking about? The next phrase. The Jesus he's talking about is the Jesus that suffered, that was executed, that was humiliated. And I could understand if, in drawing his contrast, as he's talked about the one who is the creator and the perfect radiance of his glory and all the things that went from that, if he got me to right here, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, I've got that image in my head. This Jesus. But that's not really the complete idea of the phrase. Because there is an interesting idea that comes up a number of times in the scriptures, kind of a quirk of the Greek, in that if you want to make a strong contrast between something, you jam it up against each other linguistically. Notice the contrast. Because of the suffering of death and all of the ugliness that is represented there, and smack up against that, he says, crowned with glory and honor. That's not the way the world sees that. That's the way we see it. Because we know him as the King. We know him as the Son. We know him as the perfect representation of his glory. All the things that are said, even as he dies. Contrast is there. So we have these opposing images as he brings our focus so much, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor as he serves the very purpose of what? The fourth thing. so that by the grace of God, something that we didn't deserve, he might taste death for everyone. Some commentators on this phrase, or on this verse, point out something kind of interesting. The construct of this sentence could be understood that if you, one person, you, were the only one that was condemned to die and be removed from the presence of God eternally, Jesus would have given his life for you. When he says, taste death for every man, or everyone in this verse, he's really saying, for you, if that was all that was in danger, all that was condemned, he would have still died. Come and live this life, suffered what he did for you. Now, with that image, two things. Do you see him? Do you see him very personally? And I believe that was the intent of that verse, that this is personal, that he died for you so that you could live. And then in doing that, we have this verse here. As he concludes that section and goes into 3, he says, therefore, holy brethren, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. We come together to acknowledge that sacrifice every first day of the week. Do you see him? Do you understand? That's what we're about to do.